For 3 decades, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, was the undisputed king of American late-night television. From its earliest broadcasts to its final bow in 1992, it shaped comedy, launched careers, and became the nightly ritual of millions of Americans who tuned in to laugh, unwind, and feel connected to something bigger than themselves. Carson himself was the gold standard, calm, witty, effortlessly charming, a host who made every guest feel like the most interesting person in the room. But buried within that vast, celebrated archive of monologues, desk segments, and chaotic celebrity interviews lies a chapter most people would rather forget. A time when racially insensitive humor wasn't just tolerated on that stage, it was celebrated, rewarded, and broadcast to tens of millions of homes every single night. What follows is an honest examination of seven figures whose Tonight Show appearances now force us to reckon with how comedy, culture, and racism coexisted at the very center of American entertainment. Don Rickles. Don Rickles was a firecracker. Every time he walked on a Carson stage, the audience leaned forward, because they knew anything could happen. He said things no polite guest would dare say. He made people gasp and laugh simultaneously, and that wild, unfiltered energy was precisely what made him one of Carson's most beloved and most requested guests. But that same style also produced some of the most racially offensive moments in Tonight Show history. Rickles operated under a simple philosophy. He insulted everyone equally, so no one could accuse him of singling anyone out. Black people, Asians, Arabs, Native Americans, Italians, Jews, Irish, Hispanics, nobody was off the table. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this approach earned him the label of brave and edgy. Comedians admired him. Television networks celebrated him. Magazines called him a genius. And in terms of pure craft, he genuinely was. His timing was flawless, his control of a room was unmatched, and he could transform pure chaos into a punchline better than almost anyone working at the time. But here is the problem that becomes obvious when you watch those old clips today. Equal insults do not create equal damage. When Rickles aimed his jokes at groups already facing real discrimination in their everyday lives, people who were being denied housing, employment, and basic dignity, those jokes landed harder and cut deeper than anything he said about groups with social power. Carson knew exactly what he was getting whenever Rickles showed up. He would sit back in his chair, fold his arms, and grin while Rickles fired off one racial impression after another. Classic routines included mocking how Asian people spoke, making fun of African tribal traditions, and tossing around slurs as casually as if they were everyday conversation. The audience roared. America watched and called it harmless fun. One particularly jarring moment came during a Tonight Show anniversary special when Rickles walked out, looked at a row of famous guests, and immediately began imitating their ethnic backgrounds. Exaggerated accents, stereotypical gestures, rapid-fire caricatures one after another. Carson made a half-hearted effort to redirect him, but only barely. What those old clips reveal, when watched today, is not just the content of the jokes, but the atmosphere that surrounded them. Nobody pushed back. Nobody challenged the premise. The message was clear. Rickles was the wild card, and they were letting him run completely free. None of this makes Rickles a hateful person. Many people from the groups he targeted, including Jewish communities he himself belonged to, said they never experienced him as truly bigoted in his personal life. But the material itself is the issue, not the man. Those jokes were not just poorly aged punchlines. They were built on ideas that caused real harm to marginalized communities for decades. And because Carson's show reached so many millions of people night after night, those ideas spread far beyond the studio. Rickles proved that racism in the Carson era was not underground or fringe. It was front and center, mainstream, primetime entertainment. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers did not tell jokes so much as she launched them. Sarcasm, shock, social commentary, fearless self-awareness, she had it all, and she deployed it faster and more precisely than almost anyone in the business. Carson recognized her genius early and gave her a platform that launched her entire career. She became one of the most frequent and beloved guests in Tonight Show history. But alongside that undeniable brilliance, Rivers left behind a collection of racially insensitive material that now serves as a textbook example of how everyday comedy routinely crossed lines that nobody would accept today. Rivers came up during a time when late-night comedy was almost entirely white and built on a foundation of stereotypes. Comedians took shortcuts. They mocked race, ethnicity, and physical appearance because it was easy, it was familiar, and it worked every single time. Rivers learned quickly. She went after celebrities, politicians, and herself, but when she aimed at racial and ethnic groups, those jokes revealed something important about the cultural assumptions baked into mainstream entertainment. During her monologues and guest appearances, she frequently made jokes about Asian American communities, mocking accents, making fun of driving habits, reducing entire cultures to a handful of cliches. Carson's audiences loved it. But those same jokes strengthened stereotypes that were already doing real damage in American society. Rivers also targeted Latino communities, often painting them as loud or overly dramatic. And some of the hardest moments to revisit now are her jokes about the Black community, where punchlines depended on tired assumptions about behavior, appearance, and speech. Her delivery was always rapid, playful, and seemingly self-aware, which made the stereotypes easier to swallow and harder to question. Carson almost never pushed back. He would chuckle quietly, pretend to be mildly shocked, and move on. By giving her that space, repeatedly and enthusiastically, The Tonight Show became a place where these stereotypes could flourish under the banner of humor. Here is what makes Rivers's story genuinely complicated. Off-camera, she supported civil rights and stood up for marginalized communities. She had friends from every background, but her comedy often told a different story, one that reflects a broader problem. The entertainment world rewarded jokes that punched down. If you wanted to survive in late-night comedy during that era, you often had to give audiences and networks what they wanted, even when that meant repeating ideas that hurt real people. Rivers shattered barriers for women in comedy. She changed how late-night shows worked and inspired countless performers who came after her. But her early Tonight Show appearances are also a record of how acceptable racism became when it was packaged as wit, not hidden in shadows, but broadcast, nationally cheered loudly, and replayed forever. Buddy Hackett walked onto Carson's stage like he owned the entire building. Loud, energetic, mischievous, and almost impossible to contain, he knew exactly how to grab an audience and never let go. But underneath that playful charm was a comedy style that leaned heavily on racial caricature in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable today. Out of all the major comedians who appeared on The Tonight Show, Hackett was among the most frequent offenders when it came to using exaggerated accents and physical mockery tied to race and ethnicity. His comedy grew from the Borscht Belt tradition, big gestures, over-the-top storytelling, characters defined almost entirely by stereotype. On Carson's show, he would portray Asian characters, Middle Eastern shopkeepers, and Eastern European immigrants using distorted facial expressions, squinted eyes, broken English, and heavy fake accents. One of his signature routines featured an exaggerated Chinese restaurant owner, a bit he had been performing since the early 60s. Carson's audience exploded with laughter every single time. Carson himself would crack up, sometimes covering his face as if he could not believe what he was hearing. Another favorite featured a stereotypical Middle Eastern merchant, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and vocal tricks meant to mock how Arabic speakers sounded. The humor was always framed as goofy rather than mean-spirited, but what made it harmful was its utter casualness. Hackett did not act like he was being edgy or controversial. He delivered these caricatures as if they were just regular comedy, which, in that era, they essentially were. The Tonight Show did not treat this material as risky. They treated it as normal family entertainment, and that normalization is precisely the point. Every time Hackett adopted a fake accent to portray an Asian or Middle Eastern character as stupid or clueless, he reinforced stereotypes that real people had to confront in their actual lives. Like so many others on this list, Hackett was by most accounts a warm and kind person off-screen. But good intentions do not cancel out harm. The jokes he told, the accents he performed, and the caricatures he built all fed into a comedy culture where mocking race was accepted without question. Bob Hope. Bob Hope was already an American institution before he ever walked onto Carson's stage. His career spanned vaudeville, radio, film, and television, making him one of the most recognizable entertainers in the country for generations. His timing was legendary, his stage presence was commanding, and his connection with audiences was almost supernatural. But alongside those gifts came a heavy reliance on racial and ethnic stereotypes that, when examined today, reveal just how deeply such assumptions were embedded in mainstream American entertainment. On The Tonight Show, Hope followed a consistent pattern. He would walk out, chat with Carson, and fire off jokes about Hollywood current events, and, especially in his older material, ethnicity as an easy comedic shortcut. He turned African, Asian, Native American, and European groups into simplified cartoon versions of themselves, built from gestures, accents, and predictable punchlines designed to get quick laughs. During segments about international politics, he would mimic foreign leaders with wild exaggerations, making them appear foolish, ridiculous, or strangely primitive, sometimes adding physical gestures to emphasize how different and strange they were meant to seem. Carson almost never challenged any of it. He played the polished straight man, laughing politely, acting mildly surprised, and helping package the material as wholesome national entertainment. What makes Hope's segments particularly significant is the combination of his enormous fame and The Tonight Show's massive reach. Because he was such a celebrated figure, audiences rarely questioned his routines. Critics and journalists mostly stayed silent. His jokes did not exist in a vacuum. They fed into societal biases and became part of a larger cultural pattern where making fun of race was simply accepted. Hope was shaped by his time, and he rarely seemed to come from a place of genuine hatred. But the humor still depended on exaggerating identity and difference, and those exaggerations have not survived the honest scrutiny of history. Joan Embry. Joan Embry may not be the first name that comes to mind in a conversation about racial insensitivity on television, but her recurring animal segments on The Tonight Show offer a revealing look at the subtler ways stereotypes were embedded in seemingly innocent entertainment. Embry became a beloved guest by bringing exotic animals from the San Diego Zoo onto Carson's stage, colorful, chaotic, charming appearances that offered a fun break from a usual talk show rhythm. But underneath all the fur and feathers, some of those segments relied on racialized humor and caricature that reflected the broader attitudes of the era. Her appearances frequently featured animals from African or tribal settings, and the framing that surrounded them often leaned on Western stereotypes of African cultures. Tribal-sounding drum music would play when she brought out a snake or a lion, and playful jokes would link the animal to exaggerated notions of primitive or savage behavior. Entire cultures were reduced to background color for a wildlife demonstration. Comments about what African tribes might do with a particular animal, or how people in remote places would handle an exotic creature, presented whole societies as one-dimensional and amusing to the predominantly white American audience at home. Embry herself was never openly offensive. Her love of animals was genuine, and her educational enthusiasm was real. But Carson's framing, the audience's laughter cues, and the scripted lines around her appearances made everyone in the studio complicit in a gentle mockery built on colonial-era imagery. This points to something important. Racial bias in entertainment is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it hides in the background music, in the throwaway comment, in the unexamined joke that nobody stops to question. Embry's segments remind us that even well-meaning content can reflect and reinforce harmful stereotypes when the cultural context goes unchallenged. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor holds a genuinely unique and complicated place in Tonight Show history. Unlike every other figure on this list, Pryor was not a source of racism. He was one of the most groundbreaking black comedians in American history, a performer who used comedy to expose and confront racial inequality with a precision and emotional depth that had never been seen before. But his early appearances on Carson's stage reveal something important about the systemic pressures that shaped what black performers were allowed to say and how they were expected to say it. In the late 60s and early 70s, when Pryor's career was just beginning to gain momentum, mainstream television, including The Tonight Show, pushed black comedians into narrow boxes. The industry encouraged material that reinforced certain stereotypes, even unintentionally, and rewarded performers who gave predominantly white audiences a version of black life that was familiar, exaggerated, or safely comedic. Pryor's early routines sometimes included self-deprecating humor about African Americans, using language and caricatured behavior that on the surface might appear to feed into negative stereotypes. But context is everything. Pryor was a master at exposing society's prejudices while simultaneously navigating an industry that severely limited opportunities for black performers who refused to conform. His segments from the mid-70s onward looked dramatically different, less reliant on stereotypical setups, more daring in social critique, and hugely influential in reshaping what stand-up comedy could accomplish. By that point, he was openly rejecting the old minority joke framework, confronting white audiences with uncomfortable truths about race in America that no one else on that stage would have dared to deliver. Including Pryor in this conversation is not about labeling him as part of the problem. It is about understanding how television, comedy, and systemic bias intersected, and how even a performer of extraordinary talent was forced to navigate racial norms that constrained what he could be on a national stage. Oliver North. Oliver North's appearance on The Tonight Show stands apart from everything else on this list. He was not a comedian. He did not trade in jokes or caricatures. He did not do impressions or deploy stereotypes for laughs. But his inclusion in this conversation is essential precisely because it broadens our understanding of how racial insensitivity appeared on Carson's stage. Not always through humor, but sometimes through the uncritical celebration of figures whose actions carried deeply racial consequences. North was a central figure in the Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s, a symbol of governmental secrecy and scandal. His policies and actions, particularly those connected to the expansion of substance enforcement programs and covert foreign operations, have been widely criticized by historians and journalists for disproportionately harming minority communities. When he appeared on Carson's show, he came across as composed, charming, and charismatic. Carson engaged him with friendly banter, and the studio audience responded with laughter and applause. To casual viewers, it looked like any other late-night interview. But beneath the surface, the segment gave a mainstream platform to a controversial figure without any meaningful scrutiny of the real-world implications of his record. Carson's job was to entertain, to keep the energy moving and the audience engaged, and he was extraordinarily good at it. But that same instinct for smooth, pleasant conversation meant that North was allowed to present himself positively while public debate about his ethics raged beyond the studio walls. By providing that warm, uncritical platform, the show quietly contributed to the normalization of a figure whose decisions had lasting and unequal consequences for marginalized communities. The laughter in the studio may have been entirely innocent, but the historical record places that segment in a far more complicated light. Looking back at these 7 figures, comedians, entertainers, and one political figure, what emerges is not simply a list of offensive moments, but a portrait of an era. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was the most influential entertainment platform in America for 30 years. What happened on that stage did not stay in the studio. It traveled into living rooms across the country, night after night, shaping what Americans considered normal, funny, and acceptable. Racial stereotypes that were laughed at on Carson's couch became part of the culture, assumptions people carried into schools, workplaces, and communities. None of this erases the genuine brilliance of the performers who appeared on that stage. Many of them were extraordinarily talented. Some were genuinely kind people who never intended to cause harm. But intent and impact are two different things. The material they delivered, the caricatures they performed, and the figures that Carson's show legitimized all fed into a cultural pattern where racial bias was packaged as entertainment and broadcast to a nation. The Tonight Show did not create American racism, but it amplified it, normalized it, and made it prime time. Understanding that legacy, honestly, is not about tearing down the past. It is about being clear-eyed enough to learn from it.